Subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning. Today's hearing is part of this subcommittee's continued work on the surface transportation reauthorization. With the recent rollout of House Democrats' infrastructure principles, which include a robust $55 billion investment for rail infrastructure, today's discussion around how to address grade crossing safety and associated community concerns is a timely one. Addressing the issues we will hear about today is one of my top priorities for the rail portion of the FAST Act reauthorization, particularly providing more funding for grade separations, quiet zones, and other infrastructure that improves safety and the quality of life. I grew up 100 yards from railroad tracks, so I know firsthand the impact of living near a railroad. Chicagoland is the rail hub of North America, and my congressional district has the most grade crossings of any in the country, so my constituents experience the issues we will hear about today on a regular basis. Some of those issues include blocked crossings, train horn noise, idling trains, deaths and injuries at grade crossings and along rail right-of-ways, and railroad property upkeep. I'm pleased that we have Alderman Matt O'Shea from Chicago's 19th Ward here today to talk about the problems faced by his constituents. The launch in December of FRA's blocked grade crossing reporting system is a step in the right direction. But let me be clear. The notion that the way a community experiences blocked grade crossings should try to solve the problem is to fill out a report and submit it to the FRA or call the railroad and hope the railroad will unblock the crossing is not a solution. More and stronger tools are needed, and I look forward to hearing from Alderman O'Shea, Mr. Vercruyze, and others on options they recommend Congress look at. Another issue I want to touch upon is grade crossing separations. I was pleased last year to work with my colleagues in the state of Illinois to secure funding for a critical grade separation at 63rd and or 65th and Harlem in Chicago. The Create Rail Modernization Program, which has made significant progress in making the Chicagoland rail network more efficient, was actually launched from that site, and that grade separation is labeled GS1 in the Create program project list. While I'm pleased we now have the money to get that grade separation constructed, there are numerous other crossings I'd like to see separated. The current amount authorized for the Section 130 grade crossing program is nowhere near enough to fund one grade separation in my district, let alone the many that need to be done across the country. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Christophels of the Alameda Corridor East Project and other witnesses on how a dedicated federal program for grade separations can help speed up these vital grade separations. We also need to find more funding for quiet zones and streamline the process for communities to become a quiet zone. I understand the role that the sounding of the train horn plays in notifying people a train is approaching and maintaining safety near a crossing. However, there has to be a way we can institute more quiet zones in a timely manner and make improvements that provide an equivalent level of safety to train horns. The current process to obtain a quiet zone is just too arduous. I look forward to hearing from Carl Lexie from FRA and other panelists on ways we can do this. Finally, over the years, I've repeatedly heard from numerous communities that I represent about poorly maintained railroad property, especially unpainted bridges. Railroads are just like any property owners in the community and need to maintain their property in a way that is reflective of the care and values other residents put in the community. It is time the railroads do better in maintaining their property. America has a freight rail network that is the envy of the world, and that network helps make American businesses more efficient, helping to create jobs. But there are also downsides to this expansive network. Some of these downsides can be mitigated with appropriate action. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about their recommendations. With that, I yield back, and I recognize Ranking Member Crawford for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding the hearing today. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Railroad grade crossing safety, blocked crossings, railroad trespassing, and rail suicides are serious issues that affect the rail industry and many communities across America. According to the Federal Railroad Administration, FRA, in the last 8 years, my home state of Arkansas experienced 76 total incidents due to railroad trespassing, 28 of which were fatalities. I know that complaints of blocked grade crossings have amplified recently as well. I commend the FRA and Administrator Batory for recognizing this problem and taking steps to fix it. The rail industry has invested substantially in grade crossing safety, including through the use of new technologies, community education, and other deterrents to stop trespassers and suicides on the tracks. Today we'll hear about the FRA's recent work to better monitor blocked crossings and to improve rail crossing safety. We'll also hear from railroads, state and local leaders, and other stakeholders about the problems they face with these issues, their efforts to combat them, and future needs to continue making improvements. Finally, I would note the importance of federal grants and federal funding opportunities through the Section 130 program and other grant programs that assist railroads, states, and communities with grade crossing upgrades and improvements. Thank you once again to all of our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing your testimony and responses to questions. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crawford. Just trying to find something here. Well, let me call on Representative Napolitano to introduce Mr. Mark Christophels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking members, Crawford, Graves, for inviting Mark Christophels. I believe Mark and his organization, the Alameda Corridor East, are the perfect witnesses for this very important hearing today regarding grade crossing safety. ACE was formed 22 years ago by 30 cities in my district and surrounding region for the sole purpose of improving grade crossing safety with grade separation projects and safety improvement projects. 30 cities banded together and identified the most important crossings to improve. They found the local, state, and federal funding that was needed and created their own construction authority to build these projects. They are only a few years away from being fully completed, and this is truly an incredible achievement that has dramatically improved the commute times and safety of our community, most of them in time and under budget. I want to thank the ACE Board of Directors and the staff of Mark Christophels, Paul Hubler, and all the team members who work on these very important projects. And thank you, Mark, for being here today, and welcome. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and I would like to, from our panel witnesses, like to introduce Alderman Matt O'Shea. Matt O'Shea has been an alderman of Chicago's 19th Ward since 2011. He represents the communities of Beverly, Morgan Park, and Mount Greenwood in the Chicago City Council. Like many communities I represent, the 19th Ward has multiple sets of railroad tracks running through the community and knows firsthand the positives and negatives of railroads. During his time as alderman, Matt has focused on improving local public schools, stimulating economic development, and enhancing public safety. He has been a strong advocate for the 19th Ward in dealing with some issues that have come up with respect to railroads. He's also the chair of the Aviation Committee in the Chicago City Council. Matt is a lifelong resident of the Beverly Morgan Park community and currently lives there with his wife, Kara, and 3 children, Bridget, Patrick, and Eileen. And I'd like to welcome our entire panel of witnesses now. Mr. Carl Alexi, Associate Administrator for Railroad Safety and Chief Safety Officer, the Federal Railroad Administration. Mr. Brian Vercruz, Rail Safety Program Administrator, Illinois Commerce Commission. Mr. Mark Christophels, Chief Engineer, San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments, Alameda Corridor East Project. Ms. Rachel Mala, Executive Director, Operation Lifesaver. The Honorable Matthew O'Shea, Alderman, 19th Ward of Chicago, Chicago City Council. And Mr. Jason Morris, Assistant Vice President, Safety and Environment, Norfolk Southern Corporation. Thank you all for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. I'll begin by recognizing Mr. Alexi for 5 minutes.
Chairman Lipinski, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of the subcommittee. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today regarding highway rail grade crossing safety. The mission of FRA is to enable the safe, reliable, and efficient movement of people and goods for a strong America now and in the future. As such, safety is our top priority. Railroads are a vital transportation link in our nation's economy, transporting freight and passengers in a manner not achievable by other modes of transportation. The safety of rail operations over grade crossings and trespassing on railroad rights-of-way are two critical issues that FRA recognizes continue to impact and concern communities. Trespassing on railroad property is the leading cause of rail-related deaths in the United States. Grade crossing incidents are the second. Together, these types of accidents account for 97% of all fatalities along the nation's rights-of-way. FRA believes these accidents and resulting injuries and fatalities are preventable. Grade crossing safety and trespass prevention are separate and distinct issues, yet they share two common factors. First, both are, with very few exceptions, a function of human behavior, including decision-making. Motorists may decide to disregard active grade crossing warning devices and maneuver around lowered gates, or pedestrians seeking a shortcut may cut across tracks. Second, of the stakeholders, railroads, communities, individuals, and regulators, none can solve this issue on its own. We need all the stakeholders to prioritize and address these issues. FRA is underway with implementing its national strategy to prevent trespassing on railroad property, developed in 2018. More recently, in November 2019, FRA developed and began implementation of a business plan to advance grade crossing safety. These efforts are complementary and focus on 5 strategic areas: enhancing our collaboration and outreach to all affected stakeholders, leveraging data to allocate our resources most effectively, oversight and enforcement of the rail industry and engagement of state and local governments and law enforcement, supporting research designed to improve rail safety, and funding to support implementation of proven strategies and testing new approaches and technologies. FRA has worked to enhance the agency's collaboration and outreach to stakeholders on both grade crossing safety and trespass prevention through a series of listening sessions, summits, symposiums, targeted social media campaigns, and community site visits. FRA works with the railroads, state and local government, law enforcement officials, signal equipment manufacturers and technology companies, trade and advocacy groups, as well as DOT experts outside of the FRA to identify the most effective methods of improving grade crossing safety and preventing trespass on railroad property. To complement FRA's safety oversight and research initiatives, Secretary Chow and Administrator Vittoria prioritize investment in grade crossing improvements through the department's various grant programs. For example, under this administration, over 500 individual grade crossings have been made safer through FRA's grant selections, most of this through the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program. Additionally, the risk reduction and system safety program rules will require railroads to analyze how trespasser prevention and highway rail grade crossing technology may help mitigate risks. Once these rules are published and implemented, FRA anticipates that the required analysis will provide railroads a framework for utilizing technology to combat risk associated with grade crossing and trespassers. In addition to the grade crossing safety and trespass prevention, FRA is engaged with the railroads and state and local officials to address the impactful effects of railroad operations in communities. In May of 2019, Administrator Buttori wrote the chief executive officers of the Class I railroads and major railroad holding companies regarding the impacts of quality of life associated with block crossings. Administrator Buttori specifically requested that each railroad act to minimize the occurrence of block crossing. On December 20th of 2019, FRA launched a new online portal to collect data regarding the scope of the block crossing issue. The portal allows the public and public safety officials to report information on the location, time, duration, and impacts of the blocked crossings. This information will provide FRA with needed insights to the extent and consequences of these events. In conclusion, FRA remains committed to continuing to lead, promote, and strengthen efforts among stakeholders to increase awareness of grade crossing safety issues, the potential consequences of trespassing on railroad rights-of-way, and existing and potential trespass prevention strategies. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Alexi. Now recognize Mr. Veracruz for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Lipinski, Ranking Member Crawford, Chairman DeFazio, and all the honorable members of this subcommittee. I'm here on behalf of the Illinois Commerce Commission to share challenges facing us with our rail safety efforts at public highway rail crossings. We are very grateful for this opportunity. Illinois has nearly 7,600 at-grade crossings and over 2,600 highway rail bridges. Nationally, Illinois is only second to Texas in the number of crossings. With over 60 railroad companies operating on approximately 7,400 miles of track, our rail system is the country's second largest, including the largest rail freight hub in the city of Chicago, with 1,200 trains per day. In 1955, Illinois created the Grade Crossing Protection Fund to assist in paying for safety improvements at public highway rail crossings. To date, $991 million have been authorized under the direction of the Illinois Commerce Commission towards warning device upgrades, bridges, and many other safety projects. We have seen significant accident reduction over the long term with all of our partners from the communities and railroads. However, in the last 10 years, we have seen accident rates plateau and in even certain instances creep a little higher. Our state funding, along with federal funding sources, provide an opportunity to complete many more projects, as well as address safety concerns that have demanded our attention but have lacked solutions for a variety of reasons. As I highlight 3 main areas of concern today, there is no doubt that funding is needed, but it alone will not suffice. Loss of shunt is a primary concern for the state of Illinois, where the crossing signal and warning devices have failed to properly detect certain trains. With advances in diagnostic tools, it was determined that this problem, which is infrequent and difficult to isolate, is not unique to Illinois. In response, extensive testing is ongoing with adjustments made to warning devices, signal systems, and train speeds. Further work is planned. Ultimately, though, we believe there is a need to push towards and fund the next generation of positive train control that activates warning devices and provides for more functionality in train signaling. Block crossings present another significant public safety concern that creates serious access problems for communities and helps create unsafe behavior at crossings. We have seen pedestrians crawl through trains and motorists drive around loaded gates to avoid long delays, as well as other concerns. We've also received complaints from our citizens and first responders. This has increased with the rollout of the FRA's block crossing reporting website. We have found changes in rail operations that have aggravated existing conditions or create new impacts where crossings are blocked consistently for 10 minutes to multiple hours, and in rare and frequent cases, we've had days. Railroad personnel inexperienced with an area, insufficient rail infrastructure, mechanical breakdown, regulatory requirements, and train length are the reasons typically found in our inspections. Block crossings in Illinois have also been well documented in cases before the Surface Transportation Board when approval is requested for a railroad sale, lease, or other transaction. We believe the reports required from railroads and STB dockets provide the most valuable information relative to operations, length of train, block crossing, and the status of warning devices. In 2008, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that an Illinois statute prohibiting the blocking of a crossing was unconstitutional and preempted by federal law. The Illinois statute provided requirements for interactions with emergency vehicles and included increasing fines based upon time intervals for obstructions over 10 minutes. With similar findings in other states, we believe that federal legislation is necessary to bridge the gap between preempted state laws and the STB's authority on block crossings, instead of waiting for case-by-case issues that arise that create immediate negative impacts. Trespassing and suicide along rail lines in Illinois are also significant issues. It is a problem that has been present for the past 30 years and accounts for approximately 30 fatalities and 25 injuries per year each. That's for trespassing and suicide. Each sees approximately 30 fatalities. Recent studies by the FRA identified that 75% of trespassing incidents happen within 1,000 feet of a grade crossing. To address this and other hotspots, we are working with our state lawmakers to expand funding to allow for assistance with trespass mitigation. There are other areas to address and improve I have included in my written testimony. We believe that the selection of warning devices and other improvements at a grade crossing should be based upon the best available technology and based upon corridor reviews. The use of four-quadrant gates provides an example as it addresses 25% of all crashes we see in Illinois where motorists drive around the gates. Also, for project development, we see challenges for communities in meeting funding match requirements, and we have experienced what appears to be a pullback by many railroads in providing resources to address public works projects. Further, some railroad requirements regarding project scope, cost, design, agreements, and operations during construction have led to requests that may not coincide with the needs of a specific location. Thank you again for providing me this opportunity to highlight the activities and concerns in Illinois. While I represent the Illinois Commerce Commission, I am also a member of the Association of State Rail Safety Managers, which includes 30 states plus the District of Columbia. While Illinois has many unique operating considerations, the concerns I've discussed today are common across much of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Veracruz. Now recognize Mr. Christoffels, 5 minutes.
Good morning, Subcommittee Chairman Lipinski and Subcommittee Ranking Member Crawford and distinguished members. We appreciate the opportunity to share almost 2 decades of working towards essentially zero tracking on railroad crossing improvements. I have an exhibit up there. What I'm going to do is quickly go through the what, the why, the status of our project, and of course the funding. This map identifies where we're located. We are the Southern California, or San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments, a joint powers authority of 30 cities located in the eastern part of LA County, representing almost 2 million residents. It's the green area shaded on the map that's before you. As you can see, you have the 2 ports of LA and Long Beach, major port destination for the entire nation. 40% of anything imported by water into the United States comes through those 2 ports, as well as 25% anything exported from the United States exits through those ports. Most of those cargo containers are put on rail, and as you can see, we'll travel up towards Los Angeles and then head due east through the San Gabriel Valley. We typically see anywhere between 100 and 180 trains coming through. This is an economic engine for the United States, and it's important, as was stated earlier in the intro statement. Goods movement and what we do here is essential to our competitiveness, but we also have to realize that these rail activities have consequences for the local communities. If I could have the second exhibit, please. This is what happens when you combine an intense rail traffic activity in a very heavily urbanized environment. And as you can see in the upper left, we get rail stacking. Maybe not full blocking, but it doesn't take much for a mile or a mile and a half long freight train to come through, combined with arterial streets that may have up to 40,000 cars a day to cause stacking. We typically see up to 2,000 vehicle-hour delays, meaning it's the equivalent of 2,000 vehicles idling for an hour. In a non-attainment area like Southern California, in addition to the inconvenience to the motorists, this is causing an environmental impact as well. And then what was stated earlier from the gentleman to the right of me, you get a motorist frustration. We've all experienced sitting at an impacted traffic signal where you've gone through one traffic signal and then it turns red and you still haven't got through it, and it goes the inch up again and you get that second shot, and and what you see after a while is the motorists are so frustrated they're running the red lights. What we were experiencing in the San Gabriel Valley is people so frustrated they were driving around the gates. They weren't going to wait any longer for that rail, and obviously resulting in accidents. On the lower right, we have the issue of pedestrians. A lot of these railroads cross areas where school children have to get back and forth between their schools. That in itself causes an issue as schools, as the children are desperate to get to class on time. And then on the lower left is something that's not spoken of much, and that would be your vehicle response. Lives are lost due to accidents on these crossings, but lives are also lost due to the inability of our first responders to get to a response call in a timely manner. Here you see a paramedic unit waiting for a slow-moving train. I will share in this particular instance, this had to call for a backup unit for an emergency response on the other side in a different city. Fortunately, the individual that had called for service was responded to in a timely manner. Could I have the next slide, please? This is a blow-up of our area. We have 55 crossings located within the San Gabriel Valley. What we've been doing for the last 20 years is improving these crossings. For those that have minimum vehicle counts and can't justify spending upwards of $100 million to do a physical grade separation, we've been doing the improvements that you've heard earlier, testimony from the gentleman to the right. We've been installing 4-quadrant gates, pedestrian gates, warning lights, signal interconnects, any ability to make sure that the motorist can't drive around and stops adequately for the crossings. 19 of these, due to heavy vehicle volume, justified physical grade separation. Right now, we have completed 14 of those 19. I have 3 in construction and the remaining 2 in design. The total cost for this has been $1.8 billion in funding. And we are well on our way, as stated by Grace Napolitano, on completing this ambitious program. I have to credit the 30-member agencies to start this program 20 years ago to realize that rail traffic was going to increase substantially and everything that they had been witnessing was going to increase dramatically. And they had a lot of foresight to go and start this very ambitious program to increase rail safety. We do get calls from all the way across the nation as they're now experiencing something similar, especially in Chicago, and asking, how did you guys do it? Where'd you get the funding? How did you get all of this organized? And we're proud to share those experiences with you. What I'd like to talk a little bit is about the funding. Obviously, to implement a program this ambitious requires a lot of funding. When we first started, we were getting federal funding up to 80% of the cost of these grade separations. I can tell you today, the federal contribution to our grade separations is down near 15%. The federal funding allocated to this type of program activity has diminished and didn't keep up with demand. During the last infra call for projects, the DOT will tell you that there was upwards of $12 in applications for every $1 that was available. That tells you what kind of increasing demand we're having out there to physically separate our rail activity, our commerce activity from the individual cities that are being impacted. And I want to emphasize that. We look at a lot of our infrastructure funding on increasing the ability to move goods from point A to point B, but sometimes we have to take a step back and say, at what price are we doing that? Are we mitigating the impacts of what we're doing? I can increase the rail activity, I can put my throughput in there, but these cities that are being impacted by the delays caused by the increased rail activity, we need to make aware that we have to mitigate that. We have to go back and grade separate these crossings so that those individual communities won't experience what I showed you earlier in those photographs. And the problem that we see and we've experienced in the LA area as the greatest impacts on these communities is in the most heavily urbanized environment. And if you think about an area like LA, 1/3 of my project cost is land acquisition. You're in a heavily urbanized area that's fully developed with skyrocketing land costs. On a $100 million project, I could spend 1/3 of that money on land acquisition. When you look at the benefit-cost ratio of us competing nationally for funding in a program that will fund grade separations, we don't rank very well because our costs are so extraordinarily high compared to the normal measure of benefit, which would be vehicle prevention of accidents and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I would ask that this
Mr.
subcommittee—
Christopoulos, if you can wrap up, we can come back to some questions.
Sure. Would be to look at the funding opportunities and to increase them. With that, thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize Ms. Mao for 5 minutes.
Chairman Lipinski, Ranking Member Crawford, and members of the subcommittee.
You pull the microphone closer.
Thank you for inviting me to testify about Operation Lifesaver, Inc.'s ongoing work to save lives at grade crossings and along rights-of-way. My name is Rachel Male, and I have been Executive Director since November of 2018. Operation Lifesaver started in 1972 in Idaho and quickly expanded to other states around the U.S. The national office was established in 1986. OLI is the only nationally recognized nonprofit leader of rail safety education. Our mission is to save lives by empowering the public to make safer choices near tracks and trains. We do this through a network of active programs across the country in each state and through public education and awareness campaigns. Our safety partners include federal, state, and local government agencies, highway safety education, America's railroads, and railway suppliers. Together, we promote the 3 E's: education, engineering, and enforcement. OLI's funding comes from federal partners, private sector contributors, including Class 1 railroads and railway suppliers and foundation grants. About 64% of our funding is from federal resources. Private partners account for 31%, and foundation grants contribute 5%. The heart of OLI is its grassroots network of state program directors and volunteers in 45 states and the District of Columbia. Our volunteers are out in their communities every day. We educate people about how to safely navigate grade crossings and to never use train tracks as a shortcut pathway. Our 2018 annual report shows that 1.6 million people were reached directly across the United States in over 20,000 Operation Lifesaver presentations, training classes, and events. All of these efforts are free of charge and given in the interest of safety. Our primary federal partners are the Federal Railroad Administration, the Federal Highway Administration, and the Federal Transit Administration. One of the most visible results of our federal partnerships are the competitive rail safety grants that OLI awards to state Operation Lifesaver programs, commuter railroads, and rail transit agencies. In 2019, OLI used FRA funding to award rail safety grants through a competitive process to 13 state programs, including states that rank among the top 15 for grade crossing and trespass incidents. Last year, OLI used FTA funding to award competitive rail transit safety grants to 10 agencies in 8 states. This federal funding truly is making a difference in communities across the nation. Funding from the Posner Foundation of Pittsburgh allowed us to extend the reach of these federally funded projects. While we're making great strides in reducing crossing collisions, which have fallen by 82% since 1972, it's still a startling fact that every 3 hours in the U.S., a person or a vehicle is hit by a train. That's why rail safety education is so important still today. One example of how OLI's awareness is making a difference is through our Rail Safety Week, held each year the last week in September. This year, Rail Safety Week will take place Monday, September 21st through Sunday, September 27th in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, making it truly a North American effort. OLI's efforts act as a force multiplier, leveraging federal funds for greater impact. Since 2017, we have awarded a total of 29 federal FRA competitive state grant funds for more than $400,000, with a return of more than $1.4 million to states and communities. In the Chicago area, OLI is partnering with FRA on a trespass prevention education project to see how our near-miss headphones PSA affects the behavior of a young male demographic. Illinois Operation Lifesaver also works closely with Metra Commuter Rail on education outreach. Our Find the Blue and White emergency notification system sign PSA campaign shows drivers what to do if they get stuck on tracks. This PSA is being distributed nationally through a digital and broadcast campaign. Each time a potentially catastrophic incident at a crossing is prevented, lives are saved, injuries are avoided, and communities are safer. This is our impact. If Operation Lifesaver were fortunate enough to receive additional funds from federal sources, we could expand the successful federal state grants and develop additional programs and resources for our state programs. On behalf of Operation Lifesaver, I am grateful to our federal, state, and local government safety partners, as well as our private contributors for their continued support. We hope you will learn more about Operation Lifesaver and join us in our safety efforts by visiting us at oli.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Mala. Now I recognize Mr. O'Shea for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lipinski and ranking members of the subcommittee. My name is Matthew O'Shea, and I serve as alderman of Chicago's 19th Ward. Blocked at-grade rail crossings represent a serious threat to the safety of my community, and congressional action is needed. The 19th Ward includes 10 at-grade rail crossings along the Elston and Blue Island lines. It is not uncommon for any of these crossings to be blocked for extended periods of time. While historically we have lived with the inconvenience, our problems were amplified exponentially in 2013 when CSX Railroad acquired the Elston line. Since then, block crossings have become commonplace, at times lasting for hours. In 2013, when the Surface Transportation Board granted CSX the authority to operate on the Elston line, they contemplated the impact of blocked at-grade crossings on our neighborhood. In response, CSX agreed to conditions that required them to cut any train that blocks any crossing for longer than 10 minutes. In 2015, we petitioned the STB to enforce these conditions and provided them with several hundred unique letters from residents regarding block crossings. I'll share with you some of those highlights. Multiple reports of children climbing through stopped trains, disruption to personal lives, including late arrivals at school or daycare, missed medical appointments or flights, lost wages as a result of block crossings. We even heard from a pair of newlyweds who missed the first hour of their own wedding reception after being stopped by a train. A resident who missed saying her final goodbyes to her grandfather because a stopped train prevented her from getting to Little Company of Mary Hospital. She arrived 15 minutes too late. But most disturbing are the comments from first responders who could not properly address an emergency or secure adequate backup because of a blocked at-grade rail crossing. A firefighter wrote, and I quote, "Every minute a cardiac arrest victim goes without CPR means a 10% decrease in survival rate." A doctor at Advocate Christ Medical Center described times she has been stuck by block crossings and noted that 15 minutes can determine the time, the success or failure in saving a fetus in distress. 4 years later, in 2019, now in 2020, a final decision from the STB is still pending. But CSX has successfully argued that it is operationally very difficult, if not impossible, to cut a train in most circumstances. The STB agreed and released them of that requirement. Now think about that timeline for a second. In 2013, CSX tells the STB that in exchange for the right to operate on the Elston line and substantially increase the volume of traffic in the area, it will cut any train that is stopped for longer than 10 minutes. Now, they don't actually cut the trains. And when questioned, they argue that effectively doing so is operationally extremely difficult, near impossible. Is anyone else wondering why CSX offered to cut the trains in the first place? Or why they obligated themselves to cut trains if doing so was so difficult? That original operating order included several other provisions that have not yet been stricken by the STB. The most important of which is to install closed-circuit video system at both Advocate Christ Medical Center so staff would know when a crossing was blocked and could better coordinate with emergency vehicles. Advocate Christ is the only level 1 trauma center that serves the southwest side of Chicago. It's also the busiest trauma center in the entire state of Illinois. Here we are in 2020, and yet no system has been installed. The lack of accountability is troubling. The conditions imposed by the STB in the original order authorizing CSX to operate on the Elston line show an underlying belief that railroads must cause no harm to the communities in which they operate. Who will step in to respond when railroads aren't good neighbors? Why hasn't the STB levied fines or revoked CSX's operating agreement? Federal regulation is pervasive in the railroad industry, but it is silent on the issue of at-grade crossings. That must change. Without action by Congress, this situation, both in my community and all across our country, will only get worse. Local communities are not equipped to police these matters. Congress is. I traveled today from Chicago here to Washington, D.C., seeking your support. Help me address the problems on the Elsdon line by signing onto a letter asking the STB to mandate a video system at Advocate Christ Medical Center. Second, enact simple, common-sense regulations requiring all trains to clear at-grade crossings in 3 minutes or less, and establishing a penalty system for any at-grade crossings blocked for 10 minutes or more. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman O'Shea. I'll now recognize Mr. Morris for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, good morning and thank you. My name is Jason Morris. I lead the Safety and Environmental Department at Norfolk Southern Corporation, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide the subcommittee with NS's perspective on the importance of grade crossing safety and addressing community concerns. Our industry has been around a long time. NS's earliest predecessor began operations in 1830. While our industry expanded through most of the 19th century, the rail system in the U.S. was fully built out in about 1916, when railroad route miles began to shrink. Since that time, the communities we serve have continued to grow up around us. Population increases around rail corridors, combined with explosive growth in route miles and vehicular traffic, have created a network of grade crossings that present challenges. There are over 200,000 grade crossings in our country, and collisions at these crossings, along with trespasser incidents that are often nearby, account for over 90% of rail-related fatalities. Although crossing accidents per million train miles have declined by more than 75% over the last 40 years, the accident rate and the accident rate adjusted for both train miles and vehicle miles traveled has actually improved 17% since 2007. We should not become complacent. Behind these statistics are human beings, and we are committed to continuing a push to zero incidents. We also recognize that as we conduct our operations through grade crossings, those operations can have community impacts, especially in higher growth communities and those where land use planning has not accounted for the presence of rail corridors. Grade crossing elimination and consolidation projects are the surest means of avoiding crossing accidents and occupied crossings. Finally, trespassing on railroad property is also of great concern. Enforcement and education are key to reducing the rate of trespasser deaths and injuries. Addressing these issues will take all levels of government, industry, labor, and non-governmental organizations. I'd like to give you a few examples of initiatives that NS has undertaken in these areas with partners. Last year, we began utilizing Waze technology and its unique advertising platform to test a novel approach to increasing crossing safety awareness. We were able to target audiences with crossing awareness messages where they need them most, in their vehicles. We were also able to avoid distractions by guaranteeing that these notifications would only go to stopped vehicles. Since the project commenced, the technology has reached more than 3 million drivers. More importantly, there have been no collisions in the targeted locations. We also have been enthusiastic partners with the Indiana DOT's Local Tracks program. This program provided $125 million for grant opportunities to Indiana localities interested in pursuing high-priority rail safety projects. Local Tracks has encouraged partnership among the governments, private business, and railroads to increase safety, improve mobility, and enhance quality of life. NS and local communities were successful in identifying more than 20 crossings that could benefit from separation projects and are moving toward completing construction by the end of 2024, in this great example of industry and government working together. As for trespassing, NS Police warned and removed about 12,000 trespassers from our tracks and property last year. While enforcement efforts are essential, NS plays an active role in promoting rail safety in our communities through education. Through the Trespasser Abatement Program, or TAP, NS Police hold events across our system to educate people about the dangers of trespassing. In addition to TAP, NS Police will teach a course in 2020 for local law enforcement officers that focuses on safety and techniques for investigating collisions involving trains and vehicles. Finally, we'll continue to provide safety training to first responders through our Operation Awareness and Response Program, or OAR. Our OAR Safety Train will conduct an 18-stop tour across our system in 2020. Congress can be of great help as we work toward further improvements in grade crossing and trespasser safety and minimizing the impact of avoidable grade crossing occupations. I've set forth several recommendations in my written testimony regarding the importance of Section 130 program funding levels and sources, the use of technology, and the essential role public education plays, including the work of Operation Lifesaver. NS is committed to operating the safest, most customer-focused, and successful transportation company in the world, and that includes tracking towards zero accidents and incidents. We will continue to work cooperatively with all stakeholders to achieve these aims and to ensure the North American railroads remain the envy of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. We will now move on to questions. I'll begin by recognizing the chair of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio, for 5 minutes.
Thank the chair. Thank him for holding this important hearing as we work toward service reauthorization, which will include a robust rail title. Mr. Alexi, last June we had the administrator, Mr. Vittori, before the subcommittee, and I asked, should train length be limited? He didn't, exactly address the question. There was no direct response. In fact, later he indicated he didn't think, there was much problem with 3-mile-long trains with one-person crew. But he did later say that the FAA should not become involved with block crossings because such authority is currently with states municipalities. Well, clearly because of a series of state court decisions and preemption, they can't do anything. So that's kind of a non-answer. But then apparently in recognition there might be some sort of a problem, he did later write and say that there should be some action on this issue and urging the freight railroads, and then you reinforced that in December. What steps have been taken by freight rails since that time?
Thank you for the question. Just clarification regarding train length?
Well, it's train length, which leads to blocked crossings.
So we haven't taken any specific steps other than our enforcement efforts that we do. When we go out and we do audits of the train operations to ensure that a number of things. One, that the crew is properly trained and certified and they understand the territory over which they're traveling, and that the equipment is safe. So it's an ongoing.
Right, but the issue is, and that you heard eloquently from Alderman O'Shea and others who raised concerns, that because of pressure from Wall Street, we're moving to destroying the freight industry with precision scheduled railroading, which may improve stockholder profitability, but has a whole lot of other problems. So the question is, it seems like after that hearing, ultimately, Mr. Vittori wrote to the railroads, and then you later reinforced that. And my question is, has there been any action taken by the railroads? Have they communicated back with you saying, yeah, we get it, there's a problem, and we're going to work on this even?
So we did reach out. You're correct, and I
right,
apologize.
But did they
for that.
respond? Have they responded?
We did get responses to say that we are
meaningful responses.
They were, they acknowledged the problem, and they are taking a variety of steps.
Okay, please, we would like to see their written responses. Okay, would you provide those?
Yes.
That'd be great.
Do.
Does FRA confident that if you have a 3-mile-long train, that the end-of-train devices, distributed power units, and communications work over length? We've heard repeated anecdotal testimony that particularly in challenged terrain or tunnels or else, there's no communication between the front and back of the train, 3 miles long. Are you confident that there are no issues regarding 3-mile-long trains that raise safety issues? Braking or communication or anything else?
I think that that is something that the railroads need to take into consideration when they do train makeup. They have to understand the territory over which that train will be traveling. So if there are going to be challenges with the territory on communications, they need to adjust train length accordingly. So there are operational and terrain issues that they need to take into account.
So
to
if
build
they
that
were
train.
running a 3-mile-long train through mountainous terrain where we could prove or we would know that the inadequate radio systems they have, not satellite-based, couldn't communicate, would that be a safety violation that'd be finable?
That would be a problem if we identified that there was a loss of communications over the allowed time in the federal regulations, yes.
Okay, thanks. And Alderman O'Shea, very quickly, my understanding is STB imposed restrictions to allow the use of that route, and those things have just been not enforced. Is that correct?
Yes, the main thing is not a closed-circuit television feed to our 2 local hospitals. A Little Company of Mary Hospital, which is 1/2 mile east of the Elsden line, and Advocate Christ Medical Center, again, as I mentioned, the only trauma center on the southwest
And
side
is
of
there,
Chicago.
and do you have any legal recourse with it? I mean,
No, sir.
okay, none, okay. I just want to let you know my mother's name was Dorothy or Margaret O'Shea. Maybe we're distant relatives. Anyway, thanks. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, sir.
Chair will now recognize Ranking Member Crawford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Morris, I have a question for you. We've heard a lot of testimony this morning about the impacts of grade crossing issues, safety issues, certainly block crossings and so on, as applies to urban environments. I have some questions about how this impacts rural communities. Certainly, we're affected by that too. And one of the other challenges we face in rural communities, like the district that I represent, is we don't have the resources, the funding to actually address those issues. What are some ways you might suggest that railroads, state, federal governments, and Congress, in fact, can help ensure that rural communities are able to address that issue?
Well, thank you for your question, Congressman. I think it's a great point. Obviously high-density areas, there are going to be community impacts, but those community impacts can also occur in rural areas. I think there are some great opportunities and examples where we've had some success. One, a Layton, Alabama project where we were able to work with the Alabama Department of Transportation on a project what we were able to do is take more of a corridor, larger area approach and get changes in crossing configuration, including the installation of active warning devices at some public passive crossings, modifications for flashers to flashing lights and gates at another public crossing in the area, closures, and put in a siding extension that not only increased network capacity, but allowed us an area for a train to stage where it would not impact any public grade crossings. I think when we look to projects like that, when you can take an area, and this goes to one of the recommendations made in the written testimony, that the work of this committee to continue to advocate for federal policy to incentivize states to bundle projects, grade crossing projects, into a single grant application, and some of the other written testimony of people on here about clarifying who's eligible for those. I think those are steps that when we look at Build, Infra, and CRISI can allow you to start to, we'll say, create a force multiplier. Because particularly in rural areas, the solution to one community's problem may be able to spread out and hit several other communities. I think as we improve our ability to say, hey, this could be a larger issue, and the solution may involve more than just one small community.
Thank you. I yield back.
And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I will begin talking about the block crossings. And Alderman O'Shea gave some compelling examples of the impact. I want to ask Mr. Veracruz, can you expand on why you think a federal block crossing law would be effective, in what would you recommend in terms of that law, and what would the impact be on the railroads with this?
Currently, we've had a number of examples where we've been able to work with railroads successfully to change operations, as Mr. Morris said, and try and alleviate concerns. But it's not under a direct process or something that would give the ground rules for that discussion. And sometimes we've seen where the concern then ends up on a different section of the line. So especially for change in operation locations, I believe that the use of a federal law to identify how this is supposed to be investigated, whether it's by FRA inspectors, state certified inspectors, or others, and how we communicate and coordinate with the railroads should be defined. For locations where we have continuous blockages and we haven't been able to come up with a successful solution, then a penalty structure similar to what we've seen in other state statutes for time where we get over the 10 minutes and above. For historically heavy locations like we see on the south side of Chicago, our areas of Decatur, sections of Springfield, and then the Illinois portion of the St. Louis district, I would believe we should have safety plans in place. And then we should always monitor to see if changes have created more severity. So under a federal legislation package, maybe it is trying to compile all of these different safety plans, get a good understanding of the problem locations and what's in place if a larger train does break down. Again, we've had success stories with trying to manage those issues. We have examples of emergency plans in place in and around the Midway Airport of Chicago, and those just need to be reviewed and continued vigilance in them. I hope that answers the question. If you have follow-up, thank you.
Thank you. I want to move on to something that I think there would be agreement upon, except for the question of where the additional money is going to come from, but grade separations. Mr. Christoffels, it's very impressive to me. I've been to the Alameda corridor, have not gone through the east corridor there, but this was, as you said, state and local money. And you mentioned how much federal money, the percentage of federal money has gone down for grade separations. So what do you see as the, how much do you see, would you like to see going into the Section 130 for grade separations? How would this have an impact on what you're able to do in other locations in the country?
I think I can give you a monetary example. As you know, that Section 130 may be $200 to $300 million a year. For us, let's just say, most recently, for example, we've upgraded a crossing with pedestrian safety gates. There are a lot of areas in the nation that are now doing that and using Section 130 money to initiate that work. 5 crossings upgraded to quadrant gates and pedestrian gates is going to cost us $24 million. And that's just 5 crossings located in the city of Pomona in Southern California. You multiply that across all of the crossings across the United States that could use similar improvements, and you realize how far that Section 130 money actually takes us, which is not very far at all. As I stated earlier, the demand so far exceeds the funding availability that we have out there. And there is only so much that local agencies can contribute to those type of improvements. There's only so much that local residents are willing to tax themselves because it's a trade-off, obviously, for other things that they would get taxed for. And, as I stated earlier, much of this mitigation, it revolves around interstate commerce, national good movement, and I think it's beholden upon the federal government to increase the amount of funds that go into that Section 130 program to address this issue.
Thank you, and I will not abuse my role as chair and go into another question because my time's up now. I will now recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. I appreciate it. Continuing to improve safety at our highway rail grade crossings is vital and life-saving significance. I hope in response to this hearing, we reaffirm our shared commitment on the state, local, and federal levels to ensure that trains move safely and efficiently, and that we work to minimize conflicts in the communities in which they operate. Given that U.S. freight shipments are estimated to go only up in numbers, it's imperative that we continue to invest resources, innovation, and partnership into this space, as seen in dedicated Section 130 program funding over the years. And Mr. Morris, I'd like to ask you, what sort of technological advances is Norfolk Southern or other railway companies that you can speak on behalf of embracing to enhance safety and efficiency at our railroad crossings?
Well, we've already talked about our Ways initiative as one, and first off, I'll say thank you for the question. I think technology is going to be a big part of our advancement. So that's one area that we've seen, with driver behavior being such a huge component of grade crossing safety, particularly when you look at the numbers associated with those accidents, with 36% of the accidents of people not stopping. Those types of numbers, any way that we have to reach people is going to be very helpful with addressing that next level. So that's one technology that we've taken. Other technologies, I know that we continue to work with the FRA and others on putting in remote grade crossing monitoring as one option that will give us better visibility over what's happening at the grade crossing and the ability to run analysis. So there's several technological advances that we continue to push, both on the education side and the engineering side.
Okay. And can you share any examples of partnerships between technology companies and the railroad industry that strive to help first responders and emergency service vehicles to find alternate routes in real time in order to avoid delays that could threaten the lives of individuals under their care? As our urban areas grow and roads become more congested, these delays at crossings become even more acute.
Well, again, I think Ways is a start with a partnership with a technology company. In terms of our first responders, the FRA, there is already a regulation for the emergency notification signs that are in place. So, and that's something that it's important, I think, for all drivers to know. When you get to when you get to a crossing, there is a blue sign at the crossing that has a toll-free number and identification for that specific crossing. And what they may not see is that feeds into a network operations center that we have. Over the last year or so, Norfolk Southern centralized our dispatching operations in Atlanta. So now with a network operations center that's centered in Atlanta, we have all of our dispatching operations. So when that call comes in to the police communications center, you're able to get a real person who can then plug that in and work with the network operations center, all housed in the same building, with recognizing the network impact of a lot of these things. They have access to the information from the movement of trains across our network to look for alternatives and hopefully give an idea of potential estimates on how long that may last and other alternatives. But it really comes down to the technology enabling people to better respond and answer questions.
All good to know. So what can Congress, and specifically this committee, do to help railroad industries to fight trespassing and suicides as well?
Well, another great question. Trespassing is, of course, a big concern, and I think you've hit on one of the, I won't say hidden facts, but I don't know that we really understand the true scope of the suicide issue with trespassing, because it is likely rather underreported. So the FRA is already, I know their work with Volpe, Dr. Cabri has come in and worked with not only the industry, but Operation Lifesaver and others to help us better understand as we as we work to address trespassing and some of these other issues of safety, to make sure we understand the impact that may have on suicide and that we're not doing anything to increase the problem. So I think education, not just for us, but for the communities, is a big deal and a big help. I would say, and as we put in the written statement, Operation Lifesaver is a crucial ally to the railroads and to government in how we work to some of these issues. So the recommendation about increasing their funding, I think that's something where you can put in a little and get a lot.
Thank you so very much. And my time's expired, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, and I recognize Mr. Malinowski for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to build on some of the questions that Chairman DeFazio began with. And I want to start with you, Mr. Alexi. Would you acknowledge, and let me just make this very basic, would you acknowledge that there is a relationship between the length of a train and how long people are going to be waiting at a railroad crossing?
Unfortunately, we don't have any data to support that. We know that the block crossings happen, but the information that comes with any block crossing reports.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. This seems to be like first grade arithmetic here. The longer the train, the longer people are going to be waiting for that train to clear a crossing. Is that not correct?
That, as far as if that train is moving, yes, it will take longer for that train to clear a crossing.
Thank you. And this would include first responders who may be stuck waiting 3, 5, 10 minutes, depending, again, on the length of the train. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
And the longer the train, if it has to stop for whatever reason, the greater the chance that it will be blocking a crossing, especially in a populated area where there are more crossings.
That's correct.
And yet it is the position of the FRA that decisions about the length of trains should be left entirely to the industry. Is that still your position? That you hope that they take safety into account, but that there should be no regulations here on a national level?
Yes, I believe that the railroads need to identify their, through their understanding of their operations, make those decisions.
And you believe that the railroads at the freight railway industry will make those decisions with safety as their primary consideration, even given the strong economic incentives that they face to build longer and longer trains? You trust them to do that?
Yes, I believe that, there's new rulemakings coming out for risk reduction and system safety, and railroads are going to be required to look at the risk associated with the train length.
They'll be required to look at the risk, but they get to make the decision however they want. As long as they've told you they've looked at the risk, you will be satisfied.
They're going to have to adjust their operations to address that risk that's been identified.
And what about crew size? We're seeing pressure on the industry to cut crew size, in some cases, to 1 crew member per train. Imagine a 3-mile-long train with 1 crew member. I had an exchange with Mr. Batory on this issue. I asked him, if such a train were stopped because of an accident, how long would it take the single crew member to walk from the front to the back of the train? And he memorably replied to me, well, maybe a couple of hours, but depends on whether he's a good walker or not. Got to say, that didn't build my confidence. Don't you? We heard from Mr. O'Shea about the importance of cutting trains under those circumstances. Don't you think having a second crew member might be helpful in terms of very rapidly cutting a train so that first responders and others can get through?
That's a good question. When you look at, not necessarily. I would say that the time it takes to cut a train is considerable, and given the data that we have on the time that crossings are blocked, you may even exacerbate the problem by sending someone back there and do all the things they have to secure the train that you're cutting away from. So it could create more problems in the long run.
Makes very little sense to me. It would seem that having more than 1 crew person would make it easier to perform those kinds of functions. Mr. Morris, if I could ask you, we saw an industry white paper recently that stated that one of the reasons blocked crossings occur is when trains are being held to change operating crews in order to prevent hours of service violations. And I was curious, with the implementation of precision scheduled railroading, in which railroad schedules are much more precise, how can it be that operating crews would be scheduled to time out just as they arrive at a crossing? Wouldn't you be able to avoid that?
And that's a great question, Congressman. I think one answer is that Norfolk Southern has about 24,000 grade crossings, just ourselves. So that's an average of more than one crossing per mile. So the sheer number of crossings presents a little bit of a challenge. And that's another great point that you made in terms of the scheduled railroading. We hear a lot kind of about downsides. I would think that is one improvement of knowing where people are supposed to be, when they need to be there, what they're going to do. That's why it will be helpful as we get more information to look at the baseline impacts.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair will now recognize Mr. Lamalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panelists, for being here today. I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Morris and Mr. Alexi mostly here. So, we all, I suppose, in a way, struggle with the at-grade crossings and some of the challenges that they provide, but also the flexibility they allow. So, what I hear about in some of my Northern California areas is that, especially private crossings, at-grade crossings, that railroads like to perhaps close them down so they don't have the headache of a safety issue or whatever. And I think that the more we close down at-grade crossings, whether they're private crossings that go into a processing plant or a family farm or just a home or whatever, it makes it harder on somebody for not having those availability. And if you were to close more at-grade crossings just in town, that means you now have to go a different route just to get over. I don't think there's enough money in the world to build split crossings to accommodate everything. So, I know there's a tension here on figuring that out. But Mr. Morris, what do you see as the best strategy, I think, to accommodate the need for them, but also achieve a higher safety factor? And then what is it on the education side? Do we just need smarter people that know how to use railroad crossings and take the normal warnings of looking both directions and things like that? I mean, as I look at these, and we've had the issues again in my district, some of them have no cross arms and all the other mechanisms, and those are probably $1 gazillion to put in. So is there a way to put a simpler, just maybe a simple red light that would be activated at a private crossing or a small crossing without the high expense? What can we do in order to keep more at-grade crossings in rural areas, not have them eliminated for convenience or for less lawsuits or whatever, but still achieve a safety factor that would be maybe more acceptable than what this committee is talking about today?
Another great question, Congressman. One of the recommendations that we've made, and we'll address it kind of engineering and education. From an education standpoint, one of the recommendations that we made is that this committee and others should really encourage the Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMICSA, to evaluate their current driver education programs for commercial drivers to see how effective they are. And the second part of that recommendation would be to then take the lessons learned from their evaluation and move that over to encourage the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to encourage states to incorporate more grade crossing safety training in their driver education programs. I mean, simple things of stop, look, listen, the meaning of crossbuck signs to make sure people understand it. I know when I'm driving with my children, it's that's one thing that you would do, is just point out to them what the proper behavior is.
I'm sorry, I'm limited on time here. So is there a push by railroads and other railroads that you know of to close more and more at-grade crossings, or do they try to maintain? Because again, in rural areas, the more you close, the farther you have to go to get around them. And when you have a train blocking a crossing, and in my town, you just you just turn around, you go back up. Sometimes it's a dirt road, but you go up a mile and then you find a way to cross. I mean, you kind of have to know that that's part of commerce too. So again, what's the balance on closing them and dealing with stop trains in rural areas?
Well, sir, the safest grade crossing is a closed grade crossing. It's to limit the interaction. What we try to do, and in keeping with the recommendation that the closure incentive be increased from $7,500 to $100,000, was really a reflection of the work that we try to do. When we go in a community, we're trying to give answers and options on, so it's not just close a crossing, it's maybe it's a redundant crossing, and by a little bit of roadway work, we can close that crossing, route traffic to another crossing, then create one crossing that won't be occupied unnecessarily. So it's a match, and it's a whole lot easier for us to go in and say, take our $100,000, and for that to be turned into $200,000, there's a lot larger impact than that $100,000 that we give just going up to $107,500. So that's linked to that increasing that contribution.
Yeah, okay, well, 5 minutes flies by here. Just in a lot of cases, closing crossings is an unacceptable option too, and be really detrimental to rural areas and rural processing plants and things like that. So I don't want to see an overreaction because, people can't figure it out. So thank you, I yield back.
Mr. Paultano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Christopoulos, the public agencies needing cooperation of private freight railroads. What are the challenges of working with private railroads when trying to construct a grade separation, and discuss the bureaucratic problems, delays that end up costing taxpayer and associated problems?
Thank you for the question. Obviously, we've had almost 20 years working with railroads on trying to improve their crossings. And yes, sometimes getting their attention on a taxpayer-funded project to get them to respond in a timely manner has been challenging. We're not necessarily their highest priority. Obviously, moving freight is their #1 goal, and we're considered at many times an inconvenience to them as we try to move forward on these grade separation projects. We've had several instances where we've had major delay claims from our contractors because the railroad couldn't respond in a timely manner to some of our construction projects, costing perhaps millions of dollars at times. I'd also like to talk a little bit about their contribution. Right now, the railroads by federal statute are required to contribute 5% to a typical grade separation project. Just so you know, in the state of California, that's 10% if there are no federal funds. We have deliberately defederalized projects in order to increase the railroad's contribution on some of these projects. But what's misunderstood about that statute is the railroad can still charge us for their work on the project. For example, if they have a flagman or they have a rail crew that will be part of the construction activity, the net contribution, for example, on our $1.8 billion program has been less than 2% by the private sector. And in many cases, it's actually a negative because by the time I paid them for their crew activity or other services they provided in conjunction with the building of these projects, and then I look at what they were required to contribute, we've actually participated more in funding them than they have in us in these projects. And I think that's something that this subcommittee and Congress in general should take a look at. We are mitigating impacts by the private sector. They are for-profit businesses, and we need to take a hard look at times at what kind of contribution we should get from these entities in mitigating the impacts to our local communities.
How long has it been since it's been the 5%?
Pardon me?
How long has the railroad?
The 5% has been in statute for a long time, and it has not increased.
We will be working to improve the Section 130 program. What role does FRA and federal government play in regulating grade crossing and their related projects? And can policy or federal regulations be improved for addressing grade crossings, safety, and related projects? What are the changes for improvement that you recommend?
Well, I think a lot of my fellow panelists have spoken about what might done on the FRA to improve crossing safety. Our experience has been relatively positive. We do have some quiet zones, which we have worked very closely with FRA on in implementing them for the communities once these improvements are put in place. But, one of the big issues for us as well is the block crossings. There was the discussion earlier about a 3-mile train. You can imagine in a community like ours, that's 6 crossings that would be simultaneously obstructed by a 3-mile train. And what you get and what you have to understand is that in addition to crew changes, they're looking for passing sidings, looking for a clearance track. And when their passing tracks were designed for trains that were only half a mile in length, the rest of that train has to sit somewhere. And where it sits, of course, is on active crossings. And so as the train length and train volume increases, we see more and more of our crossings getting blocked as they're waiting for that passing opportunity on their overcrowded system. And even technology won't correct that. So I just wanted to share that with you, that we've seen that, and I think FRA needs to take a hard look as train length is increasing, what that will mean on, especially in an urbanized environment where you have very close proximity of your crossings. There are no opportunities for a motorist to veer off onto a different street to get by this particular train.
Thank you, Mr. Christopoulos. Mr. Alexi, in December 19, last year, the FRA pointed out that there are no federal laws or regulations pertaining to block passage. Why is that?
I can't speak to why there is not a regulation. There is a regulation about if the unnecessary closure of a crossing with the signals being activated. So there is that. If there are switching operations that are causing the signal to, or the grade crossing to close and unnecessarily block that crossing. But I can't speak to is why there is not a regulation about occupying a crossing.
Would you agree that it's time for a change?
I think that is something that's we should certainly look into. I think it's a difficult thing to regulate. I think there's a variety of issues that need to be taken into account. There are regulations that the railroads already have to adhere to, and prohibiting the blockage of crossing may then contradict compliance with those other regulations. And also, this is a potentially difficult regulation to enforce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll submit questions for the record.
Mr. Balderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel, for being here. Mr. Alexi, for the first question, the FRA recently awarded funding to 4 law enforcement agencies to address railroad trespassing enforcement. Your findings show a significant reduction in trespassing incidents in these 4 local jurisdictions. How do you think these funds helped reduce railroad trespassing, and does the FRA plan to expand this program so more law enforcement agencies can crack down on trespassing incidents and improve safety?
So thank you for that question. Yeah, we have seen the benefit of having these law enforcement liaisons that work with law enforcement and to train them, to spend time out there educating the public, working with judges for the prosecution of violations to make the local law enforcement understand how important it is that they do enforce the local trespassing rules. So yeah, it has been very, very helpful, and we will expand it as we're currently doing that. We have a grant that's out, and we're looking at the applications that are coming in. So we hope to expand this to as great an extent as we can.
Thank you very much. Mr. Morris, thank you for being here this morning, and I know that you've discussed this a little bit this morning, but I just want to get into it a little bit deeper because we are dealing with Ohio, and that's my home state. But in your testimony, you discussed Norfolk Southern's partnership with the Waze, navigation app. I see from your testimony that Toledo, Ohio, is one of the pilot projects targeted. While I don't represent Toledo, I'm interested in how we can expand this technology across the Buckeye State. Can you discuss how this program has been successful, and does Norfolk Southern have plans to expand it to other parts of its network?
Yes, sir. Happy to discuss it. Our pilot project really It started in March of 2019, and the idea was to utilize the advertising aspect, the targeted advertising aspect of Waze. So Toledo was one of the areas. There were 7 crossings that we wanted to target, and what we do is set up a geofence around the area that we'd like to target. When a motorist uses the app and they're inside of that geofence, you get an advertisement that pops up, an awareness message from the railroad. That allows us to reach not only those that may go over the crossing, but those that are generally in that area. It only pops up when the vehicles stop, so we could kind of sidestep any issue or thoughts about distraction. We are planning to continue the campaign because we found great success in those areas. The idea is to kind of take that total market saturation, expand it not just in the number of locations that we're targeting, but also taking the message and potentially, I guess you'd say, specializing the message for the area or for what we're finding in that specific area, and then linking in on the back end for those who want to save it for later or click through, more in-depth messaging about Norfolk Southern, about grade crossing and trespassing awareness, and really link that into our overall grade crossing awareness campaign. And that would match with the efforts that of our Operation Awareness and Response Train. As we go around the communities, we've added a grade crossing safety component to that to go along with the education that we provide for first responders, for hazmat and accident response and those issues.
Okay. Thank you very much for your answer. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back my remaining time.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Alexi, I wish, we kind of talking in hypotheticals pretty much for this discussion, but I wish I was still speaking hypothetical, but, frequent cause of fatalities at grade crossings is a driver trying to make it across a railroad crossing before an oncoming train arrives. Sadly, there were 2 fatalities just last month in New Jersey when a train hit a car in the railroad crossing. It's unclear if the driver was trying to cross while the train was oncoming, or if there were other circumstances. However, I believe the FRA should be giving states all necessary resources to enhance grade crossing safety to minimize fatalities. Can you elaborate on what assistance the FRA is offering to help states prevent deaths from motorists entering grade crossings in the path of oncoming trains?
Well, we certainly we have grade crossing inspectors across the entire country, and we work closely with communities. We go out and we make sure, one, that everything is functioning as it's supposed to at a crossing, and we do a fair amount of a lot of outreach. But as far as what we're giving to states in particular, as far as the Office of Safety, which is my office, I'm not familiar with anything in particular other than what we do as far as our enforcement and outreach efforts.
So the only resources are in outreach, and is that correct?
I think there's probably more, there's additional resources in our grant program that if localities want to apply for CRISI grants or those types of grants, that they certainly can. So FRA in general does.
Those are readily made available. The communities know of these grants?
Yeah, they're publicly, they're announced and they're out there.
Okay, all right. Mr. Morris, key component of grade crossing safety is ensuring that grade crossings are not blocked by oncoming trains for extended periods of time. What is Norfolk Southern doing to reduce the risk of blocked grade crossings and improve grade crossing safety overall?
Another very good question, sir, and I can understand the interest of everybody, and that's why we appreciate being a part of this hearing. I think one of the things that we continue to stress is just the partnership with the communities that are out there. With the emergency notification system coming in, we get, when we get a report, it's routing that through to the appropriate people to understand what's happening and understand why, and then evaluating to see if there are repeated instances. So I think there's a difference in handling on a case-by-case basis. A one-off versus something that appears to be happening repeatedly are going to be handled differently in evaluating, hey, what is the proper course of action here? And as we've already indicated, sometimes it's an engineering answer, sometimes it's an education answer about where we can stage our trains, sometimes it's an education answer with the community about specifically what's happening. But really, the feedback loop is the most important thing of understanding, hey, we understand it is an issue, and we are trying to get to the bottom of what's going on.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Pence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indiana has over 3,800 miles of Class I railroad tracks, the majority operated by CSX and Norfolk Southern Corporation. As the crossroads of America, our rail industry is one of the busiest in the nation, holding true to our nickname as the Crossroads of America, moving over 328 million tons of freight annually. According to the 2018 Indiana State Freight Plan, our state ranks 9th in the U.S. for railroad miles, yet that same year we ranked 6th in the nation for railroad crossings. As Mr. Morris says in his written testimony, we're now number 5. Safety is the major concern. The city of Rushville, in my district, has a population of 6,000 people. When a freight train stops at one of their main crossings, it splits the town in half. Ambulances and firefighters could be rerouted, threatening lives in case of emergency. Mr. O'Shea, as you noticed, 10 minutes could mean zero chance to save a life, as it does in your community where my grandfather and grandmother lived for many years. In Muncie, Indiana, the Tillotson crossing splits a local neighborhood from Westview Elementary School, and you're not going to believe this, but maybe you can. I have received calls from constituents and local officials in Muncie who have witnessed children climbing under and around the train to get to school. I'm sure we can all agree that that's a major safety concern. Mr. Morris, we are grateful that Norfolk Southern vowed to work with Muncie Indiana Transit System to address this specific problem. In addition, I'm pleased that in Rushville, CSX joined a task force with local officials to reduce stoppages and the impact on their community. These are both great examples of industry and government working together to improve grade crossing safety and minimizing avoidable stoppages. Mr. Morris, I appreciate that you highlighted Indiana's local tracks rail overpass program, a public-private partnership grant program created by Governor Holcomb in 2017 to enhance railroad intersections with local roads. Regardless of these ongoing efforts, my office, and I know my colleague and fellow Hoosier Representative Carson, our offices are inundated with calls about problems that our constituents encounter in rural communities. Mr. Morris, in your testimony, you agree there is more to be done, stating the rail industry is not satisfied either. With population size among the grant eligibility criteria, small towns like Rushville will likely never qualify for local tracks or Section 131 funding like LA or Chicago. Mr. Morris, do you see an opportunity for industry and government to develop a strategy like an operating procedure or a set of standards to mitigate the impact on rural communities that will not be awarded competitive grants because of their size?
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir, I do. And I mentioned we have about 24,000 grade crossings on Norfolk Southern. The fact that I recognize Tillotson should, I think, tell you everything about it. But that's a perfect example of, we mentioned engineering as one solution, education, and this is a great example of education both inward and outward. That was a situation where we were actually able to kind of take that feedback, look at the operation, get a sense of what was creating the issues, and by adjusting the locations of pickups and setouts of customer freight on 2 trains operating in the area, adjusting some of the timing of some of our more irregular local trains that were operating on less of a scheduled time, we think that we have addressed that issue. But I think that's a perfect example of where it goes to, some of these issues really, they start to get very complicated because it can create a cascading effect if you're trying to fix it by pulling on the wrong lever. And that was a perfect example of getting kind of the safety people, our operating folks together and saying, hey, what gives? And you should see that decrease. But perfect example of education works both ways.
Thank you all for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair will now recognize Ms. Norton for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing. But I have an interest in railroads and trespassing and the statistics that show that people are often killed by walking the railroads. This is a kind of romantic notion of walking on the railroad tracks. And I have some statistics, and there's also the notion, of course, of taking a shortcut across the railroad tracks. And so I'm trying to find out what we're doing about that. And I noted some data that surprised me. Up to 500, 400, between 400 and 500 casualties, or I'm sorry, fatalities, perhaps many more injuries than we know, because only the casualties, I believe, are reported. Now, I appreciate that the FRA has looked at the statistics, done a lot of research, and come up with some notions like educating the public. I'm more interested in one of their ideas about law enforcement and policing and fines. I recognize that would take some work, but when you have that number of fatalities, it seems to me it's worth the work. Now, I do note the interest, therefore, in warning signs and medians and signage generally. Are there, I suppose this question could go to Mr. Veracruz, Mr. Christophs, or Alderman O'Shea, or all of you. Are there any, what work is being done that you know of, and are there grade crossing projects that may be ineligible for the federal funding 130 program that you believe should be eligible under that program to bring funding to it as a safety matter?
Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer the question and address trespassing more from the state funding perspective and what we're doing, and maybe that could serve as guidance to the federal level and what we've been discussing with the FRA. In 2001, our state statutes were changed so that we could fund pedestrian bridges, overpasses, underpasses, and that was in direct response to a location where we had block crossings and kids going through trains. Ultimately, the first bridge project that we did construct was at a location where a middle school was separated from a whole community, and the children would have to walk 1.5 miles to 2 miles along an unimproved area. The 7th grader, she was killed at this location, and from there we started building bridges, and that's when we started getting involved in what was really trespassing mitigation. More recently, in the last, I would say in the last 6 months, we've been looking at our state statutes on how we can address trespassing mitigation, especially with the findings by the FRA that 75% of the incidents happen within 1,000 feet of a crossing. How do we expand that definition of the crossing, or at least whatever we're working on tries to take care of 2 factors. So as part of our state statute and review of what we're trying to do is to allow us to help fund those projects, which might be fencing, it may be more bridges that we've done in the past. We know how to do those things. I think the bigger challenge is how do we make it for law enforcement so on their normal patrols and their normal day-to-day operations that we integrate it? How do we use technology, whether it's radar systems or other detection modes for trespassers going off of the crossing, and then provide that information to law enforcement in a usable way? We've worked with programs before, actually one that was funded federally, the PEERS program, the Public Education and Enforcement Research Study, and I believe some of these programs after that have been just a part continuation. Those did show benefit, but that involved overtime, that involved trying to make sure you have those resources always available. So our question is, using technology today, what can we get to the police departments and how can they address it in a more immediate fashion? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a matter that has received too little attention from the Congress. But these fatalities demand our attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, Chair will now recognize Mr. Bost for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Many of you, just so you know, I served as a professional firefighter. I was a union firefighter for many years. And I was trained at one of the best schools in the nation, the Illinois Firefighters Academy. It's second and best in the nation, only to New York. Now, part of that training, and let me tell you, you can look at me, it was a long time ago, the training dealing with hazmat spills, whether it was train or whether it was other transport, and or dealing with fires on those type situations was a pretty intense training. And then, and I'm not joking about this, is actually some of the training, then we had what was known as the cop test. We would come with the fire truck, okay? In an 1/8 mile off, you get your binoculars out, and if you think you had a hazmat spill, if the cops were down, don't go in. That really was part of it back then. Now, things have changed since then on how training goes. But that being said, we're trained on a lot of things. And just recently, we had a train derailment right in my district, and there was a fire. And fortunately, no lives were lost, and no property was destroyed except for the damage to the train that occurred there. That being said, Mr. Morris, how are you working? Because I was in a fire department that we had professional training because we were paid by the city could afford that, we could be afforded to be sent to the best training. How are you working with our rural area first responders on trying to make sure that they're trained to the level they are that can assist to be the responders they need to be?
It's a very important issue, and Norfolk Southern's approach has been to, as much as possible, take the training to the departments, and that is the operation awareness and response training that I mentioned, and the stops across our system. With those 18 stops, that's really, we have an 18 stop tour scheduled for 2020. This is something we've done for years. We pick areas across the system, we let people know that we're coming, and then that training is provided free of charge to first responders to let them know what they need to know when it comes to dealing with hazmat, and to let them know resources that are out there. The industry has put a lot into developing technology resources like the Ask Rail app that's out there from the railroad industry and available for our first responders, to where you can actually log in and at the click of a button get a better understanding of what is in the consist. And not only that, but it routes you out to some of the emergency response guidelines, such as your clear distances and evacuation, your isolation distances, to let you know more about that particular commodity and the dangers associated. Beyond that, we fund scholarships, again, on the industry level, to our CERTSI program out in Pueblo, Colorado, that's run in collaboration with TTCI. To give an even more in-depth training where people leave that training HAZWOPER certified. So I think the industry would agree that it is very important for our first responders to have at least some familiarity with the different commodities that we're moving and how to appropriately respond in an incident.
I'm glad you mentioned the app, and I'm glad technology is being dropped in there, because whenever I was firefighting and I was responding, you had a book in the glove compartment, and then you had to go with the number and the description and find it, and it had all that information. But in today's technology, a firefighter can en route, hopefully, be able to get the information. So the other question I have here, and I've just got a short period of time, but so when you say you notify the communities, you just go down your existing rail and say, okay, this is a community that hasn't been trained yet, boom, that's when we're gonna, and then you reach out to the local law enforcement and or first responders, or how does that done?
We have hazmat officers located around our system, and hazmat officers and environmental operations officers that really a lot of them are former first responders, and they have partnerships and relationships with the communities. It's on our website. It's also a link to it from our website. I don't think it's on the actual Norfolk Southern. It's a separate website that you can get to from there that will allow you to get the information. And I believe it's joinnsor.com. That's in the written testimony as well. So people can go to that and get more information about where those events are when they're coming.
Thank you very much. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Carson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Morris, in your testimony, you asked for increased federal funding for the Section 130 program. How has your organization invested in improving grade crossing safety, and how does fiscal year 2020 projected spending compare to previous years?
Another very important topic, which is Section 130. I think it's at $245 million for 2020, and our recommendation that it be maintained at that, if not increased, as we moved into the future. It's important to realize that we're not just asking for this money and not investing anything ourselves. The railroad industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars a year on our infrastructure maintenance as it directly connected to grade crossings. Norfolk Southern itself spends $30 to $40 million a year maintaining warning devices, and we're reimbursed under $2 million for that work. So it's an ongoing effort. I think when we look to Section 130, what we're looking at for those projects are projects that can have an outsized influence. These larger grade separation projects where we think we can solve a lot of issues in collaboration with localities and others to really have a larger impact. So that money's not for little things. The $245 million or more that goes into that, I think you can see from the other witnesses, there's an outsized impact of what goes into that.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Veracruz, your testimony states that 4 quadrant gates should be the goal of efforts to install, renew, and significantly change crossings. What safety benefits do 4 quad gates offer railroads and communities, and do barriers exist to installing these gates?
Thank you very much. four-quadrant gates, we have 178 locations in the state of Illinois, and primarily we have an accident figure where approximately 25% of people go around the gates. The four-quadrant gates will seal off the entire crossing so that that person or motorist cannot go around the gates. And we've gone farther in use of vehicle detection in the crossing. And along our corridor from Chicago to St. Louis, those vehicle loops also have additional services. So this vehicle detection will actually communicate back to the train if we have an obstruction, say a farm vehicle, a truck, or some other implement on the crossing. So there we can provide safety in terms of avoiding derailments. Our passenger trains, those passengers on the train did not go around a gate. We need to find a way to address all of their concerns, but four-quadrant gates to us provide the best available technology that solves about what we see, 25% of the accidents, and if we were not to look at that, we've not looked at all of our engineering solutions. And as such, we found a great benefit in accident reduction through that area.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carson. Now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity. I apologize I missed opening testimony and some of the other questions, so I'm going to keep my questions to more of a local level issue. And Mr. Veracruz, good to see you again. Thank you for being here. I've heard from one of my good friends, Mayor Chris Coos in Normal, Illinois, for those of you who have not been there. It's issues regarding rail blockings. I understand his office has been in close communications with the rail company, which really is key to addressing these local level concerns. And as we draft the next surface transportation bill, what can we as legislators provide you in Illinois to make sure our state is the safest in the country when it comes to rail crossings?
Thank you very much, and good to see you too. With the rail crossings, I think in terms of block crossings, we would like to see a plan in place as far as when operation changes occur, how are these to be addressed? If there's a continuous need to address the block crossings, then are we looking to infrastructure plans, and how do we fund those plans? How do we get all the parties together and formulate what is a coordinated effort before it happens? That would be a primary goal. After that, expanding past the normal area, loss of shunt issues and trying to go to the next development of positive train control. Right now, we still have track circuits that were derived from the late 1800s. That's the underlying technology that's used. And then obviously through our great use of computing power, we've been able to augment that, but we still are relying on track circuits. So under a new federal legislative initiative, I think it would be nice to see help and have positive train control addressing the grade crossings.
Okay, well, I appreciate your viewpoint on that. You mentioned the short shunt issue and the impact on rail safety. I know this is also an issue that's been raised in connection with Amtrak's Illini route and how it may have affected their on-time performance. The Illini route services my constituents in Champaign-Urbana, and can you speak to your efforts with the railways, IDOT, and Amtrak to address this issue so that our commuter trains arrive safely but also on time?
Thank you. There has been a great effort in the last 2 years with the railroads, all of the major parties. Yesterday I was at a meeting of the Loss of Shunt Committee, which had pretty much the who's who of railroad signaling and warning devices present to help address the concerns. And as a result, there's been modifications to warning systems, settings, there's been software modifications, but yet there are the speed restrictions that you've discussed that ultimately affect or impact what the commuter time may take. But at this point, we're working towards the next product, which is something that has been utilized in Europe for quite some time, and it's to help assist that track circuit that I discussed with the old signal technology. We just signed an agreement to help fund that portion. In addition, the railroads have expended a great deal of resources. Amtrak is working towards the solution, as is the Illinois Department of Transportation. So this project, we anticipate, will be a year to 2 years, but ultimately, we still believe the direction would be to move to that next level of radio-based or wireless detection.
So the implementation of PTC technology, as we see it nationwide, probably isn't going to affect the issue that you think we may be having on the Illini route.
Correct. It does not address the at-grade crossings, and my understanding, it doesn't solve the loss of shunt concern.
Okay. Well, I look forward to continuing to work with you and the commission and also our partners in the rail industry, Amtrak and IDOT, to move forward on both of these issues. Thank you for your time, and thank you to all the witnesses. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all of the witnesses who came this morning. I apologize I couldn't be here for all of your statements. I had a bill up in a neighboring committee, but I'm glad to see not one but two witnesses from Illinois here. Thank you, Alderman O'Shea and Administrator Vercruz. And of course, it makes sense that we have great representation from the Chicago area at today's hearing. Chicago is America's transportation hub with over 7,400 miles of railroad tracks and thousands of rail crossings. We're quite familiar with rail and all the positive and negatives that come with it. Safety, of course, must be our top priority, so I'm glad we're focused on that today. One area of safety I think we often overlook, however, is the long-term dangers that communities in close proximity or immediate adjacency to heavily industrialized areas and major rail infrastructure. More often than not, it is working-class communities and communities of color that run along railroad tracks. These are areas that need more infrastructure investment. Right where I live and the district I represent, we have trains and tracks running right through our neighborhoods by our schools. It's part of life. You hear the trains rumble at all hours of the day and night, and of course, we're all too familiar with block crossings. What we don't talk about enough are the environmental justice implications of block crossings. Those of us who don't live near railroad tracks may not see this, but I see it all the time in my district. A few weeks ago, the Chicago rep from CSX, Tom Livingston, gave me a tour of CREATE, a landmark public-private partnership to clear up congestion in Chicago. And my key takeaways: when we invest and bring government and the public sector together, we can provide real solutions. But there's still so much more we can do. On the northwest side, we get backups along Belmont between Pulaski and Kedzie Avenue. On the southwest side, by my home, we've got issues like the ones we see on Pulaski and 33rd Street. When block trains back up traffic, it's not just a nuisance or congestion, it's a health and safety issue as well. Idling trucks from the local freight and logistics operation lead to heavy tractor trailers idling right outside of schools and right through neighborhoods. There are plumes of smoke at times and the constant smell of thick diesel fumes. These are the kids that walk all along these congested truck routes. My question is, what happens to the families and the kids for whom this is their everyday? This is simply the air they breathe, day in and day out. What about their safety? So, Mr. Christoffels, in your testimony, you shared a lot about the success of the Alameda Corridor project. Can you talk about the added air quality and environmental benefit you've achieved by successfully completing grade separation projects?
Yes, thank you for the question. I stated earlier in my testimony the crossings that we have eliminated through grade separation has reduced approximately 2,000 vehicle hours of delay per day. So that's 2,000 vehicles sitting there idling in these neighborhoods that you were just alluding to. That's pollution that these residents and children are not being subjected to. The same thing also in providing these crossings, we are moving the freight through their communities as opposed to allowing those trains to sit and stall and idle, which is also improving the air quality for those residents living in the area. And of course, there's beyond just the environmental, it's just a safety issue. We now have the ability to get students to their classrooms via these underpasses, where they will not be subjected to standing at a crossing and being in close proximity to the rail engines as they're traveling through their communities.
Thank you. And do you believe that more federal funding for these grade separation projects and a dedicated funding stream would help?
Absolutely, yes.
Excellent. Now I want to turn to Alderman O'Shea, and maybe perhaps if time allows, back to Mr. Christoffels. Can you speak to some of the same concerns about blocked crossings and the resulting air quality issues that can arise from idling trucks and diverted traffic? Because in Chicago, the first person they call is the local alderman, as you know too well, Alderman O'Shea. And do you believe that the federal government could provide a more dedicated funding stream to build grade separated crossings?
Thank you for the question. Something I didn't talk about in my testimony, but also is a problem in communities throughout the country, and I've certainly seen it when trains are stopped, maybe not necessarily blocking a crossing, but stopped because the modal facility or the yard they're headed to is crowded. They will sit in my community for hours at a time with the locomotive running, and that's a tremendous amount of pollution that the residents in that area will see. And like your neighborhood that you represent, the neighborhood that I represent, I remember when the Surface Transportation Board came out, they couldn't believe the proximity from the residential homes to the rail lines. I mean, literally in my community, there are homes 60 feet from the rail line. And when you have 5,000-foot-long trains with a locomotive running, idling for, in some cases, hours at a time, that's a tremendous amount of pollution being released in the air, which is really bad for a community. So although the problems I've seen in my community are a little different, that most certainly is a real problem. We've got to keep these trains moving. I think any community would understand that we need freight rail traffic. This is commerce, but we need the trains to move. And when they stop, whether it's blocking a crossing, which is dangerous to both pedestrians, but also dangerous and problematic and quality of life issues for motorists and community residents, stop trains that are idling is also a very serious issue as far as it pertains to pollution. So I would welcome any thoughts, any ideas to try to resolve some of these issues as it affects my neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. The chair now recognizes Ms. Wilson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Preventing grade crossing collisions and fatalities is a major challenge in Florida, where passenger and freight railroad tracks stretch across the state. I have watched several troubling videos of vehicles narrowly escaping bright line trains in my district. While these incidents did not result in fatalities or injuries, so many others have. FRA data and news reports indicate that since 2017, at least 40 bright line collisions have resulted in fatalities. It is absolutely incredible, and we have never experienced anything like this before in the railroad industry. Given this deadly increase, I urge FRA to review these incidents and issue recommendations. I encouraged Brightline to attend this hearing. They declined, but said they would include a statement for the record, because we need to find new effective solutions to this problem, because whatever everyone has been doing up to this point is simply not working. I have a few questions. Mr. Alexi, the rail line in Florida itself has been around for years as part of the Florida East Coast Railway. But Brightline began operating in 2017 and has dramatically expanded service. In the past, slower freight trains used the line, but Brightline now runs up to 20 trains per day, operating at an average speed of 80 miles per hour. Since Brightline launched 2 years ago, an average more than one person a month has been killed on the tracks, in a car, on a bike, or on foot. An analysis by the Associated Press found that this was the worst death rate per mile of any of the nation's railroads, and as of today, more than 40 lives have been lost. How is the FRA working with Brightline and local authorities to reduce incidents and fatalities?
Thank you for the question. We're well aware of the issues down there, and it is important to us. We've been working with Brightline from the beginning, from the inception of the project, and to ensure that their operations, one, are in compliance. We've also worked with them for outreach reasons to reach out to others, to the communities along that route, to understand the differences in the operations that you point out, that these are much faster trains, and the time that they catch up with you is much shorter, so there's less time. But the important thing is to get people to, whatever we can do to get them to stop trespassing. That is an important element of this, and that outreach is vital and important to that. We also have, again, I've spoken about it before, about the grants that are available to do any type of grade crossing upgrades or improvements and the like, and also trespass prevention as well for local communities.
Have you given any safety recommendations to Brightline itself, and have they been implemented? Recommendations that the company can do to stop some of these deaths?
Well, we've stressed the importance of outreach and working with the community.
We've done outreach. We've done outreach. We have, in fact, I taped a commercial myself for the community and for people to understand the difference in the speed of the trains, but that has not worked.
I will say that we have done a lot of enforcement. We have been down there making sure that, one, their gates and lights and their crossing equipment is working right, and their operations are all in compliance, and generally their compliance record is very good. So we continue to keep a very close eye on them.
Have you spoken with them at all about having law enforcement or private security companies stationed at the crossings when the trains are scheduled to come along the tracks?
I have not. I can check on that to find out if we've had those conversations. I know the president of Brightline was up meeting with our deputy administrator to talk about different strategies they have implemented. I'll have to go back and double check that to find out if that conversation happened, and we can submit that.
Ms. Mulch, thank you and your colleagues at Operation Lifesaver for your work to promote rail safely and save lives in Florida and across this nation. Can you highlight Operation Lifesaver's work to reduce Brightline-related fatalities and the potential impact of increased federal funding? How would that help those efforts?
Thank you very much for the question. We recently participated in a safety blitz in Florida with Brightline, with our state coordinator there, and my colleague, Shantez Bailey, who's here with me in the room. Did multiple press conferences. They also ran a mobile van throughout the state where the tracks run to share the importance of when you see tracks, think train. It's really the outreach and the education. I think a lot of people don't realize how fast the train is moving. It's an optical illusion. Or they're distracted and they don't stop, or they're used to driving around a gate because trains never come, it's moved slowly. So we're trying to change human behavior, which is a daily as well as an hourly project that we undertake through our education efforts. But we're also reaching back younger, to the younger ages, to students in schools, to work with school administrators, to get the word out through their school assemblies. We're working with drivers' education programs so that they learn the signs, as my colleague to my left talked about, so that drivers know what the signs mean. and how to yield or stop at a crossing. So we do a multitude of trainings and education and outreach throughout the state of Florida as well as the other states in the country. One of the things that's really, that we're noticing is the selfies and photographers taking pictures on the tracks. So one of the outreaches that we did with Brightline was educating photographers, amateur photographers, and the teenagers not to take photos on the tracks. So they had this mobile selfie booth with rail safety messages near the crossings as part of events so that they were part of a community outreach festival.
I yield back.
Thank you. We've been going for over 2 hours now, so at the risk of prolonging this, but I want to see if anyone had any short comment that the witnesses had any short comment they want to add at this time. All right. Thank you. I think everyone else thanks you too, probably. I want to thank all of you for your testimony today. The discussion has been very informative and helpful. This is a issue where we need to figure out where we are going to draw lines, because no one, as I said in my opening statement, our freight rail network is the envy of the world and helps our country be, all of our businesses be more efficient. There are issues, though, that arise because of the vast network of freight railroads. And we need to figure out the right place to make sure that communities are protected from the negatives that do come from that. So I think all the testimony today will be has been very helpful as we move forward with writing the reauthorization bill, and we'll continue to have discussions with all of you and relevant stakeholders as we move forward in the next month or two. So with that, I want to ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open till such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. And I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered, and if no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.